Okay, hello everyone. So we are going to cover now our final topic of PSY 111, which is social psychology. So it's quite a large lecture, but I do think we'll be able to sort of get through this within about an hour. So make sure you take lots of breaks and keep pausing me. Um, and if there's any discussion that we need to have around this, I invite you all to either contact me directly via email, or we can organise a phone conversation as well if you prefer that. So now what we're going to go through over this next hour is really learning about what is social psychology to the point where we could define it. We'll talk about components of social psychology, which is attitudes, and we'll look at what their role is in predicting a person's behavior, which is really important as a clinician. We'll describe some of the social cognitive processes that people try to use to understand themselves and also the other people around them. And we'll also describe about how the self-concept can guide the way that we think and remember information that we think is relevant to ourselves. And we'll finish up our lecture talking a little bit about interpersonal processes such as love and conformity and group sort of psychology. Oops. Back there we go. So what is social psychology? So we started out the semester, we looked at psychological perspectives, we went through to research methods, we then looked at biology, and I told you around about sometime within them three lectures that we have two real big goalposts in psychology. One of them is biology, and at the other end of the goalpost is culture and sociology. So we're at the far end of that goalpost now, talking about social psychology. Now, when we talk about social psychology, we're wanting to really understand what influences the way people think, feel, and behave in a social mindset. Remembering that our thoughts is what we actually think, that's cognition. Our feelings are our emotions, which we've talked about before, and we have our behavior, which is our actions. And we know now that all of these connect to each other. What I think can change the way that I feel and the way that I behave, and the way that I behave can change the way that I can feel and can change the way that I think. Now, a big component of understanding social psychology is understanding what an attitude is. Now, an attitude is an association between a particular act that I might do or an object and how I evaluate that act or object. It can involve both positive and negative and sometimes ambivalent or mixed impressions about that object or idea. Now, attitudes involve three key components. They're cognitive, emotional, and behavioral. Now, this one's about exams, this example, which is probably very relevant for you guys coming up to next week. Cognitively, you know, and you can think that, well, exams assess knowledge. That's why they're there. But the emotional thought that you have towards an exam is that you probably get anxious about exams. And the behavioral aspect might be that I studied hard for my exam. Now, collectively, the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral aspects are all going to be forming your attitude towards exams themselves. Now, we could also take this and put it in place of a dental checkup. I might think that, yes, a dental checkup is going to make sure that my teeth and gums are healthy. The emotional aspect, though, might be that I get anxious going to see or going to visit the dental practice. The behavior here may be that, oh, well, I go to the dental clinic to get a checkup. Or it might not be. Behaviorally, I don't go. And that is a little bit of a disconnect in our attitude, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. I've already skipped ahead and I've already given you an oral health example. So when we look at attitudes, what a patient may have, it can really center around how they perceive the dental visit. We've talked about dental anxiety before, we've talked about dental fear. A lot of this can form in the attitude that I have towards the clinic or the clinician, but it can also stem from the attitude I have towards overall health. Maybe I don't view dental health as important, or maybe I view dental health as being very important. So my attitude towards dental health or towards my visit or towards toothbrushing may lead to me having a very positive and a very positive behavioral response to that. Now, dimensions themselves are very complex. They run on a continuum um, of various dimensions. It really matters whether or not an attitude is durable and the impacts that relates to the strength of an attitude. If an attitude is going to be very important to me, it's probably going to have some personal relevance. If the attitude is accessible to me, it's probably going to be very easily to activate. So, for example, I do feel very passionate about dental health. So, if somebody asks me, what do you think, what's your attitude towards dentistry or dental health? I'll be straight away into it saying, well, dental health is very important. Whereas some people might not have that ease of activation. They might think, oh, well, I'm not really sure. There can be also an awareness of an attitude that you might have that could be implicit or explicit. It might be something that's very under the surface for you and something that you're not really truly aware that that's your attitude. And it might be something very explicit, something that you can articulate very well how you think and how you feel towards a particular object or a particular person. Attitudes can vary also in their complexity. They can be very specific, they can be very detailed, and sometimes they can just be very general. Ambivalence in attitudes relates to very either negative or positive feelings existing at the same time. We're not always entirely sure about a particular thought or feeling or person that we have. And it can be very important sometimes for the strength of an attitude to be coherent and whether or not we've got this internal consistency in how we think and feel about a particular object. Now, if we want to predict behavior from attitudes, and this is super important when we talk about dental health and we talk about overall health, and we talk about things like health promotion. If we want to go in somebody where we want to try and educate somebody to change their attitude, we want to know whether or not we have a likelihood of changing their behavior down the track. Now, lots of research has been focused on social psychology and attitudes, and we tend to see that when attitudes and the behavior are very specific, they increase the likelihood that the behavior will be enacted. If there's environmental reinforcement that matches that attitude, so for example, if we were trying to educate young children to take on a new health act such as brushing teeth, we might see, well, if their parents are also on board and they believe in it too, and they're giving some external conditioning and reinforcement around that, then we'll see that attitude will strengthen in the child. We can also predict behavior if we see that attitudes are shared by others as well, that a group of people can all share that attitude together, and that attitudes themselves are implicit, they're unconscious, they are strong, and they have been developed from personal experience. Now, when we talk about persuasion in social psychology, we're referring to a deliberate attempt to change an attitude held by another. And this is really what we try and work on sometimes when we do health promotion. There are several components for an effective persuasion to take place, and we have to make sure that we attend to each because it's very crucial to the success of having a persuasive appeal. Now, with every single patient that you meet, you are going to, in a certain way, try and persuade them. You're going to offer them advice, and the sort of idea of that advice is that they would take it on board, but whether or not they receive that advice and are persuaded by your advice to take on that behavior is a different story. We do see that persuasive sources are very credible. So by having a degree in oral health, that gives you that credibility. It would be very different somebody talking from the CEO of Westpac telling you how important it is to brush your teeth. It just wouldn't match in terms of the credibility. The persuasive source have also got more of an impact if they are considered attractive, and that's not just model-like attractiveness, but well presented, hygienic looking, They are very likable as a personality, they are considered very powerful in their influence, and that they are considered similar to the recipient of that information. It's very important as well that persuasive messages match the recipient's level of consideration of the topic. There can be sometimes a disconnect when an expert might tell a novice information about a particular topic. But the idea is there that there's no real relatability. And we've talked about relatability before when we've talked about motivation. If I don't think I can relate to a particular topic or I can relate to the person delivering it, the chances of me feeling internally motivated and in the context of social psychology, taking on that new piece of information to be persuaded by it can be very low. So it's very important that we try and build the same level of delivery and consideration. Persuasive channels are something we have to really think about as well. If we're trying to send a message and we want that message to be to change behavior and to act on persuasion, we really need to make sure that it's more personally delivered, so face to face. You'd have a very different um, effect if you sent a text message to your patient to say, make sure you brush your teeth every day. It reduces your risk of periodontal disease versus telling them face to face. The context that a persuasive message is given as well should be delivered at the right time and place. We call this attitude inoculation. Again, giving somebody advice in the dental chair would be received a lot more consistently versus giving them the same dental advice at a football game, for example. Persuasion is also very much more likely if the receiver has a weaker attitude to whatever it is you're telling them or is attending to the message very directly. Now, when we go through the process of persuasion, we have to look at the characteristics of messages and how they can change attitudes. Now, a model called the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion proposes two routes that persuasion can take place. We can target a central route, which is going to induce recipients to consider arguments carefully to change attitudes. So they're going to really think about this. They're going to think about maybe pros and cons. They're going to evaluate it. Whereas we can also take the peripheral route. This is going to appeal to emotions. So what we want to do is here, this will provoke an emotional response from an individual, which will then manifest in some particular change to their attitude. And classical conditioning of an object with an emotional response is very much built on this peripheral route. And sometimes simple repetition of a message can alter an attitude change as well. Now, using an example from a clinic as well, if we see that we really need to persuade somebody to start brushing their teeth more, for example, we're going to think, how can I deliver this information? I want to persuade them. I'm credible. I'm likable. I'm talking to them at the same level of understanding. It's still not working. I could try and educate them, and that would be taking the central route, and I could start talking about things like periodontal disease. I could start talking about mobility of teeth. I could start talking about decay and explaining how decay works and how at a cellular level it works to really get them to consider what is going on there and how they can then inbuild that into their life, which eventually would hopefully change their attitude. However, quite often clinicians take the route of saying, well, I'll appeal to emotions. And you might say something like, well, if your teeth become mobile, this could eventually result in tooth loss, which could cost a lot of money, which means you're going to have to do a lot of invasive surgery to replace the tooth with a prosthetic device. Okay, in the appeal that would provoke an emotional response, and then they would change and be persuaded by that message. Now, there's a very popular term in psychology and in social psychology called cognitive dissonance. Now, this refers to a perceived discrepancy between an attitude and a behavior that's enacted that results in a state of what we call psychological tension, similar to anxiety. The best example is this sign here that's saying do not enter and then enter only. Okay, it's not coherent, it's not cohesive. Now, this tension can motivate the individual to want to reduce it, and they can do so by either changing the behavior that they're doing, or they can change the attitude towards the behavior, or they can change the perception of the inconsistent information. Now, cognitive dissonance can occur when a person experiences a discrepancy between the attitude and behavior, or between the attitude and a new piece of information. And then they have to be motivated to want to reduce this dissonance. Okay, now we've talked about lying before, and I've said to you, it's part of human nature to a certain extent that we all do lie. But you might consider yourself as not a liar, and liars are bad people. And sometimes you may tell a lie and then think, but I just lied. But I think that liars are bad people. But I don't think I'm a bad person. And there's different attitudes towards the same behavior going on here, but they're not in alignment. Now, self-perception theory suggests that attitudes change in dissonance experiments due to people observing their own behavior. Sometimes we're not always aware of it, and we have to become very perceptive to our own self to understand that there is a dissonance. And when we observe what we've done and what's different, then we're motivated to change it. An example would be of this, that we know that speeding increases the risk of car accidents. That's my attitude towards speeding. Yeah, I might speed on a daily basis, and that is my behavior. So in this example, my attitude and my behavior do not align. There is cognitive dissonance. In order to reduce the tension, the individual might either change the behavior. I could stop speeding, and then my behavior and my attitude would be now well aligned. I could change my attitude, so I could tell myself that speed is only a minor factor implicated in road traffic accidents, so therefore I'm justifying my attitude towards it's okay to speed in some circumstances. And I could change my perception of the inconsistent information. So speeding in this example is only dangerous in young drivers and therefore does not apply to me because I've got lots of experience of driving. Now, I'm sure many of you might be thinking, yep, I've done this before, I can understand this. It's a good example of cognitive dissonance. Now, social cognition itself, so social thinking, we could call it, is a process where people are going to make sense of themselves, others, and the interactions and relationships that they're involved in. We never really truly know what is going on in another person's mind. We'll never truly know what's going on in our future patients' minds when we're talking to them and when we're engaging with them. And I'll never truly know what's going on in your mind, and you'll never truly know what's going on in mine. But what we do is, as humans and as social beings, is that we look for signs that indicate what their thoughts are and what their feelings might be. And then what we do is we make assumptions from these. Now, I've talked about assumptions before, and I've said to you before, you should never assume unless you have to, because our assumptions can either be very accurate or they can be very inaccurate. Now, for the following images, these slides won't be in your lecture notes because they're images of people. What I want you to do is, you don't have to write it down, but I want you to just think of your first automatic thought. We've talked about automatic thoughts before. These are thoughts that just pop into your mind. The very first thing you start thinking about when you are seeing this image. What I want you to think is, I want you to think about what this person may do professionally. I want you to think about their personality, what it might be. I want you to think about their lifestyle. What do you think they do on a weekend? What do you think their hobbies are? And then I want you to think also about their morals. So what do you think they are in terms of a moral individual? Lying, committing crimes, empathy, helping others, all that sort of thing. So what we're going to do really is just form a nice picture of an individual here based on what we're viewing. Are we ready? Okay. And the next person. And the next person. And the next person. Now, some of you may have noted that this person and this person are the same person. Now, you will have had many different thoughts, and as a class, you will all have many different thoughts. And if we were doing this face to face, it would have been very interesting to hear all of these. Now, if we're going to look at this individual here, we're going to see a white coat and a stethoscope, and we're going to go straight away and say this person must be some sort of physician or doctor. If they're a doctor, we could assume that, well, they've obviously done a lot of study, they obviously earn a lot of money. To be a health practitioner, you have to be ethical, you have to be giving, you have to care about others more than yourself, and so on and so forth. This person here has lots of tattoos, quite muscly. A lot of people could think a lot of different things here. This person here is actually a very much committed criminal in Australia. I can't exactly remember now from memory what his crimes were, but I think he got about 20, 30 years in jail. And now what we've done here is we could stereotype this information. So there's obviously quite what there used to be, or there still is in some areas, a perception against tattoos. And I've talked to you as a class about my experience with my tattoos and how people have stereotyped and perceived me. But it would seem in this instance that when people say, oh, people who have tattoos tend to commit crimes would actually fit the mold. Whereas we look at this gentleman here, and we might think, okay, he's got a combi van, uh, he lives in it, a bit of a hipster maybe, maybe a barista, if we're going to stereotype there. But this gentleman's actually I think, one of the top 20 richest men in the world, top 20, maybe top 30. He's a software engineer, and he lives out the back of his combi van. Whereas this gentleman here is the same as the one in the first image. So he's the doctor. He is a doctor. He's a very famous heart surgeon in America. He's done lots of research around cardiovascular disease and how to sort of increase life expectancy here. But again, we could have looked at him and thought, oh, he's got tattoos. It looks like a bit of a biker, maybe a bit of a criminal, maybe a bit rough around the edges. If you thought about what he did for work, he could be like, maybe he looks like a biker, maybe he's a mechanic, and so on and so forth. Whatever it was that you thought and had your approach to each of these people is your own assumption. Okay, that's your own assumption and your own stereotype towards that person. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing, and it's not necessarily always a good thing, but it's human nature to form them. Now, when we do perceive other people, first impressions really do matter. Okay, this is our first initial perception of another person. Of particular importance is physical appearance, in particular, attractiveness. With attractiveness, we see that this effect called the halo effect. Now, this is a tendency to assume that positive qualities cluster together. Okay, if somebody has an element of positivity about them, let's say the doctor at the beginning, white coat, stethoscope, so we automatically assume this person must be a good person, they must be ethical, they must have a lot of money, they must be a family man or whatever it might be. Okay, we have all these positive qualities that gravitate together. And those mental representations influence the processing of subsequent information that we're going to hear and see about that person. And we also, when perceiving others, we have to form schemas, stereotypes, and we can have prejudice and different attribution issues when it comes to that, which we'll get to in the next few slides. Now, schemas we've talked about before as well. These are patterns of thought that we have, that we organize our experiences and knowledge. So I think I've used this example last week when we were talking about cognitive development and how children form schemas. So I use the example of do I know the difference between a cat and a dog. Okay, they both got four legs until someone tells me that a cat meows, and then my schema about cats starts to grow. I start to assimilate new knowledge into it. Now we can have person schemas. This is going to represent specific types of people. So if I was to say to you, tell me about what a librarian would be like, you might think that person might be quite reserved, a bit of an introvert, quiet. And I contrast that with saying, well, tell me what an extrovert's like. Or maybe a person schema might be that, tell me what a student's like. Many people might say a student must be very smart, very studious, very focused, very driven, very exhausted, very time poor. And another person might have a schema about a student that says, oh, they just sleep all day and go out on uni parties every night. We can also have a situation schema as well. And this can represent different social situations. So if you were invited to a formal event, you would already have an idea of what the event would be like if it was formal. Okay, you might be wearing a suit, you might be wearing an evening gown, you might expect a sit down three-course meal, for example, versus an informal event where you might wear more casual clothes. You might be having more casual food options. We can also have role schemas. So this is going to represent the expectations of social roles. So that might be how we have a schema around what we expect of you as a student versus what you expect me as an academic. And then we have schemas about what we expect of parents, what we expect of children. And we can also have relationship schemas. So this represents the expectations, what we have about ourselves and others in unique relationships. So expectations we're going to have around siblings and couples and people who are single, people who are married, people who are divorced, and so on. Now, schemas allow us to enter into new situations with an idea of how we and others are going to act. Okay, they're very, very useful, but they can be very rigid and prone to error. We can form stereotypes, and a stereotype represents characteristics that we're going to assign to another person based on their particular membership to a specific group. From that, sometimes we can then sort of enact prejudice, which this involves judging others based on a particular stereotype. And then this can become discriminatory. So we can have discrimination then, where we're going to act negatively towards a person. This really ties into the very famous saying, don't judge a book by its cover. Now, stereotypes are necessary because we absolutely do not have enough cognitive resources that are necessary to take in every single new situation we encounter. We cannot look at everything and think about everything as if we've never come across anything like it before. Stereotypes help us to fill in the gaps and to save time and to save cognitive resources. And they're not always negative, but this doesn't predict their accuracy and, in essence, could, in many circumstances, induce prejudice towards another group. Now, two examples from your textbook here are that women are maternal, older adults are wise, and these are considered quite positive stereotypes. But this is the issue with stereotypes. If we really think about the term women are maternal and what the meaning is, it can also be extremely prejudiced as well, because not all females are maternal and not all females will feel maternal. And if there's a stereotype out there that says that females are maternal, that person could feel very disconnected and very emotionally sad if they don't follow the stereotype that people are assuming. And the same here, that older adults are wiser. This has a natural assumption that younger adults are not wise or as wise, which is not always the case. You might have this in your career when you go into the workforce and you will look quite young in comparison to some of your work colleagues. And some patients might think, you're young, you don't know anything because you're not old enough yet to know everything. Okay, but that might not be the case. You're going to be very smart, you're going to be very capable, and you're going to be very able to achieve the similar, if not same, or even better results sometimes. Now, when we push stereotypes to sort of a more negative level, We can fall into the realm of racism sometimes. Now, racism reflects a negative attitude towards members of a racial group. The stereotype in this example is the cognitive component, it's the thought process, whereas prejudice is the emotional component, and discrimination is the behavioral component. Now, an example here is that, for example, racism against Indigenous youth, the stereotypes, the cognitive perspective here could be that the thought that gangs of Indigenous youth commit crime. The prejudice here, my emotional response could be that I feel anxious when walking near a group of Indigenous youth. Whereas the discrimination, the behavioural component, could be to refuse to allow a group of Indigenous youth into my shop. Now, the issue here, of course, is being that not all gangs of Indigenous youth commit crime, and many gangs of Indigenous youth don't commit crime. But based on my thought here, the stereotype, I've then gone ahead and discriminated against a group of people because of it. Now, when we look at the roots of racism, we see that racism may actually lie in personality. The authoritarian personality includes the tendency to hate people who are different. And this personality type is associated with somebody who's had a very dominant, stern father. Very much when we talked about parenting styles last week, the parent that shows very little emotional connection, but is very much, very hard and fast with rules and discipline. Now, there are two forms of racism that we can sort of think about when we talk about attitudes and stereotypes. And we can have explicit racism. This involves a very conscious use of a stereotype and the expression of prejudice. And then there's implicit racism, and this is the unconscious influence of stereotypes towards members of a racial group. Now, when we talk about the roots of prejudice, so the roots of the emotional feelings that we might have around a stereotype, it really reflects the socialization process from a parent from a child sometimes. In Australia, we see that the minority and majority subcultures tend to express towards the preferences towards the majority culture by preschool years. We want to be in the dominant group. We want to be in the majority culture. There's a natural drive there in the socialization process. And there's also a concept that prejudice itself is functional. It's the notion that prejudice preserves the interest of the dominant class. Now, here's a picture if you've seen the movie Hunger Games. And in that, there's different memories going now. Different sectors, class sectors from 1 to 12, I think. I can't remember the exact number. But it is very much in the interest of this group here in number 1 and this to preserve their position in the dominant class and keep these people away from the dominant class. Now, by having two different sort of class systems and them being prejudiced around, we can see that intergroup hostility can arise. It centers around an in-group versus an out-group. Basically, these are persons who belong to your group or not. Now, within your own cohort of students now, you've probably formed some friendship groups. And those friendship groups will evolve over time. But what you might start to think sometimes, and if you want to escalate that to your own friendship group outside of university as well, we often see that persons not in our group are perceived as more similar than they really are. We tend to say, if, say, one person that we know in a group is, let's say, very well in sort of not very well behaved, we tend to think all the people that they hang around with aren't very well behaved either. And we start assuming that people in that group are very similar. In this example too, if something happens with that group, if they do something very good or very positive, we tend to explain it away. and say, well, it was only because of this reason. It wasn't actually something that they had control over, maybe, or something they wanted to do. Whereas when they're negative behaviors, we tend to attribute to internal causes. And again, this has a self-serving concept here to our own in-group and our own individual self in that in-group as well. Now, when we talk about intergroup hostility, Sheriff came to the conclusion that if we're going to reduce hostility between two groups, we must have contact and there must be cooperation amongst the members of that group. And what we can do as members of two groups is create these superordinate goals. So these big goals that we want to achieve. Many times over history, we've seen countries that have been at war with each other resolve out of war by setting superordinate goals, setting these goals that are very much bigger. Okay, maybe it want to be sort of end famine, improve health, and it will be a goal that they want to come together as one group on to achieve a better outcome more often than not. Now, when we talk about attribution, attribution refers to the process of inferring the causes of mental states and behaviors of yourself and others. We are ultimately very much intuitive scientists, and we tend to do either an internal or an internal or an external attribution. An external attribution is a behavior that is due to the situation. So, for example, if your boss starts yelling at you tomorrow when you go to work, you can externally attribute it and say, well, the boss yelled at me today because let's say it's April 15th. It's not, but his taxes are not done. So he's obviously very stressed because his taxes aren't done. And that's why he's yelling at me. Or you could internally attribute it. So the behavior might actually reflect the person in this example. So you might think that the boss yells at everyone because he's actually a hostile person. So his action and his behavior is actually due to him as a person, not due to an external situation. Now, internal and external attributions depend on the level of consensus that can be reached. So this is the extent to which behavior is operative in a group, whether or not it's consistent, so the extent to which a person responds reliably to a stimulus. So for example, if the boss is always yelling every time taxes aren't done, well, this would be very consistent. So we would probably very much go with an external attribution here. Whereas if they were consistently yelling every day, then we would probably attribute that to an internal attribution. And they also depend on distinctiveness as well. So this is the extent to which a person responds to different stimuli, whether or not they're going to be producing the same behavior in different circumstances or only in a particular circumstance. So an example here is that your friend complains that her hairdresser is mean to her and does a bad job of her hair. You search for an explanation of her complaining, so you ask yourself the following questions. Is there consensus? So does everyone complain about their hairdresser? 2, is it consistent? Does your friend always complain about her hairdresser? Or is it just this one time? Is it distinctive? Does your friend only complain about her hairdresser, or does she complain about other service providers she uses as well? Now, in customer service in general, a lot of managers will go through an internal versus external attribution process when they receive a customer complaint. The first thing will be, well, is this the first complaint they've had about in this context? Is there actually something wrong? Is there consensus about what's wrong here? Essentially, is it the fault of the company itself? Versus, is it externally attributed where you might say, well, this person tends to never be happy. Sorry, internally attributed. This person always tends to be unhappy with whatever we do. We can't please them, so that must just be them, and there's nothing we can really do to satisfy them. So to summarize the 3 attribution topics, consensus is very much based on if people behave the same way, you're likely to make an external attribution. So for example, if everybody complains about the same company. Consistency, if a behavior is consistent, you're likely to make an internal attribution. And distinctiveness, if a behavior is distinctive, you are likely to make an external attribution. Now, when we try and modulate attribution, we can either discount it, augment it, or have a look at the attribution style. We can discount it by downplaying the role of a variable because of the influence of another variable. So for example, the boss yelling, we've discounted it by saying, well, it's because of their taxes, okay? It's the only reason why they're yelling. We can augment it. This is where we can see an increase in internal attribution for certain behaviors. We can say, actually, you know what though? The boss is usually pretty angry with other stuff, so I'm not surprised he's getting angry now. And we can look at the attribution style. So some people have a very habitual manner of assigning causes to behavior events. Some people always look at the external attribution end of the spectrum, and some people may overemphasize the internal attribution as well for the cause of behavior. Now, just like stereotypes, we can have errors in our attribution. We may think something is internally attributed when it's actually due to external reasons, and vice versa. We call this fundamental attribution error. This is a tendency for observers when analysing another's behaviour to underestimate the impact of external factors and to overestimate the impact of internal factors. This is an example where you might see that a friend is quite down or quite snappy or irritable, and you might think, what's wrong with you? Thinking that it's a very personal reason why they're there. But actually, there's something else going on externally that's influencing their behavior at this current time. But we usually fundamentally tend to go down to and make an error of it and internally attribute that behavior. And with attributions, we do ultimately have a self-serving bias. Now, this is a tendency to attribute our success that we do, so our wins, our gains, and our champions to what we would say would be because of an internal factor. And when we have failures and issues, we tend to externally attribute them. So, for example, if you got a 100 out of 100% for your written assignment, you may internally attribute that and say, wow, I've worked really hard on that. Like that was me getting that good mark. It'd be very unlikely that you would say, oh, Adam must be just a very easy marker. And he just gives everyone 100%. Yeah. You'd have probably a self-serving bias around that. You'd want to say it's probably because of internal reasons and it's because of your own doing that you got that grade. Whereas on the other side, if you got a very low mark, you might then tend to externally attribute that towards the marker, so myself, and you might say, "Oh, Adam's just a harsh marker." Oh, Adam just didn't like that section, so he didn't mark it high. Okay, and you wouldn't actually internally attribute it to saying, "Well, actually, I didn't do the task properly. I didn't respond properly. I didn't follow the guidelines. I didn't follow the criteria. I didn't follow the marking rubric and such and such." And ultimately, we tend to see ourselves in a more positive light than what others tend to see us. Now, when we talk about social cognition and social thinking, we also have faulty thinking and faulty cognition. Okay, we do have cognitive biases. We have these things called heuristics, and these are basically cognitive shortcuts. We come to conclusions very quickly because we don't want to think about things for too long, and we don't have time often to think about things for a long period of time. And we can make very much big errors in judgment and in decisions and in social interactions by doing that. We can also have motivational biases. So these are our own schemas, so the way we think about things that can be influenced by our own wants, desires, needs, and goals. We can also be biased on our interactions of cognition and motivation. And there's a term called confirmation bias. So we tend to, in some circumstances, interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing beliefs and theories. So, for example, if you thought somebody was um, a bad person, for example, and then you find out that they accidentally broke somebody's phone that you knew, you might internally process that and take that new information and go, oh, well, I always knew they were capable of that. I always knew that was that. I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised, to be honest. And then people follow this confirmation bias role with this new information. Now, at the center of social psychology is you. It's the self. It's the selfish. And the self is the person, including the mental processes, the body, and all the personality characteristics that go along with it. Our self concept in itself is a schema, and it guides our thinking and memories of relevance to ourselves. That's very much our cognitive component of the self. And we also have this concept of self esteem. We've talked about self esteem before. And this is an individual's evaluation of the self and how much he or she likes and respects the self. And this is the affective component of our self. And when we try to understand the self, and that's a very much $1 million question, again, we look at different perspectives of psychology. Psychodynamic psychologists would see that self-representations are mental models or representations of the self that play a key role in personality. So our self is very much connected directly to our personality in this example. The cognitive view set of ourself will be the self schema, as we've just talked about, which is the way we're going to think about and remember information that is relevant to ourselves. And when we place the self in a cultural context, the self is viewed very differently between collectivist and individualist cultures. So the collectivist culture will often view themselves as interdependent and define themselves in terms of social relationships. For example, their mother, their grandparent, or their employee. Whereas an individualist culture will view themselves as independent and define themselves in terms of personal attributes such as intelligence and whether or not they're friendly or not. I will note just back on the self and culture that it is very fluid in today's modern age. It still exists, but it's very rare that somebody would be only one of these in terms of how they would view themselves. Often people will view themselves as an identity of the self within a culture, collectivist culture, as they are as a mother, a grandparent, an employee, and also how they are as an individual. Now, motives that can guide our perception of ourselves is, again, self-esteem, so the way we're going to feel about ourselves. It's the consistency that we have about ourselves. So this is the motive to interpret information that fits the way we already see ourselves. There's a bias with that. And then we have self-presentation that we want to maintain. This is the process by which we will try and control the impressions that others form around us. Okay, so that summarizes the first component of social psychology. So we've covered the way we think about particular things. So we've talked about attitudes, the way I form attitudes. We've talked about the behaviors that can come out of attitudes. We've talked about how we can persuade people to change their behavior by reconsidering their attitudes. And we've finished up with talking about the self in there. Now, we'll finish off the lecture today by talking about interpersonal processes in a social context. Now, if we look at two human beings, when they come to talk to each other, I've just mentioned in the first part of this lecture that if we're going to get persuaded by somebody and we want to receive information, there are certain things that we need to hold dear, such as attraction. And attraction is a very big contributor towards the success of that interpersonal process, and it's going to govern really who we like and who we love. We tend to like and love those who are physically close to us, so we have a higher interaction and accessibility to that interaction, versus environmental spoiling. So we don't always like people who are there too often as well. We tend to like and love people who can provide rewards. This can be in terms of wit, charm, goods, great conversation, compliments, niceties, and this really forms around many social exchange theories. And these hold that for successful social relationships, there has to be some sort of reward gained from it. Now, we might think of situations where people, it doesn't seem like somebody's getting an award, that maybe one person in that relationship takes a lot from the other person. But the other person may indeed get a reward from helping that person and the feel good feelings that go along with helping somebody else. So there is still, at the core, a reward there. We tend to like and love those who we share similar attitudes, values, and interests with. And interestingly, we also tend to like and love those who are on a similar, if not the same level of physical attractiveness. We call this the matching hypothesis. It's important to note here, though, that different cultures do have a different perception of what physical attractiveness can be. Now, when we talk about love, this is again another topic that we could talk about for a very, 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 very long time. Love itself is an enduring interpersonal bond, and we've talked about it. It's got many survival needs and benefits for us to do this evolutionary. It's about forming an interpersonal bond with another person that's going to endure time. And when we look at love as a concept, we can make two very broad key distinctions between passionate love and companionate love. Now, passionate love very much is focused on intense emotional and physiological arousal with another person, and compassionate love is very much a deep affection and friendship and emotional intimacy that we have with another person. Now, there's a study here, and I apologize, the page number may not be accurate in edition 5 of the textbook, where we look at the years of relationship over time versus the intensity of love. And we see that the reality is that the intensity of passionate love, so this is the red line here, and then we look at the blue line of compassionate love, they fluctuate over time and over the course of long-term relationships. And we see that passionate love tends to sort of decrease over the years, and then it will have moments where it spikes back up, but it drops very low, and it spikes back up and drops very low and spikes back up. Whereas we see companionate love in long-term relationships tends to take a very steady and higher intensity and keep climbing higher and higher as the years go on. Now, sometimes people can misinterpret a reduced passion love in their relationship as a sign that their relationship is in trouble, but it's actually something that's very normal and very common amongst relationships. Now, when we look at the evolutionary views of love and sexual strategies about why we love, we have to understand it in the context of the feelings and behaviors that we're going to associate with the concept of love, and consider that these are evolved mechanisms that tend to lead to reproductive success. So remembering that evolutionary views and evolutionary psychology is looking about survival of a species. And lots of research has shown that males and females tend to use different sexual strategies. Males in the short terms tend to seek out young, fertile females. In the long term, they seek committed relationships that have sexual access. Females, on the other hand, tend to use short-term liaisons to assess and attract males, and then in long term assess the ability to commit resources in return for sexual access. And then women tend to prefer older males with resources, and men tend to prefer younger females due to fertility reasons. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule. This obviously has very many different applications and very many different interpretations. But a general theme is sort of shown and does hold true across many cultures. We tend to see similarities in mate preference across cultures that do support the evolutionary perspective. Here we've got the ranking of importance being very much indispensable importance up the top versus zero unimportant. And then we've got the different countries and different cultures here. And for this first one, we're looking at good financial prospects. Men are in green, females are in blue. So we see here that in all cultures, females tend to view good financial prospects of their partner or of their mate as higher ranking and higher of importance than men. And over here, if we look at this chart, so zero here going down means how many years younger than that current male age versus older than the person. So let me reword that. When the person took the survey, this zero represents their current age. In the survey, they were asked, what age would you prefer or like your partner to be? They then rank that. So if they go above, they were saying they like them older than themselves. This goes up to +4 years. If they said younger, this goes all the way down to -8 years. We see in all the data that men chose and selected female mates that were younger than them, and that females selected men that were older than them. So again, supporting the evolutionary perspective. Now, another key concept of interpersonal processes is the concept of altruism. Now, altruism refers to an intentional behavior that is going to benefit another person. It's a behavior that has no obvious gain for the provider. So this is stuff like charity work or giving or donating to charity. The behavior themselves have obvious costs. So if I give money to a charity, it is financially costing me. It could be something like I'm donating time and resources and care to people through a charity, which would still come at a cost to myself. When we look at why we're altruistic, because if we do sit back and think, why would we do things that have no direct benefit to ourselves but help other people? Because many people don't. Many people will not engage in them sorts of behaviors, but on the other side, many people do. And we can see that in some circumstances, that acts of altruism are really just selfish acts that benefit us as the actor. They can provide us with emotional satisfaction, and they can reduce negative feelings that we might have. By helping somebody else, I could feel better about myself and think, well, I'm such a good person. I'm a really good person. I help other people. And whilst I've helped other people in that process, which is fantastic, I've also got some level of emotional satisfaction about myself in this as well. There is, though, true, genuine altruism, which is basically best described as natural compassion for another person. And then there's reciprocal altruism as well. Now, natural selection, so evolution of species and survival of species, tends to favor animals and species that are altruistic if the benefit to each other is greater than the cost of the altruism. So we see that many animals here will clean themselves, bacteria and fungi, and will live off each other and thrive and grow off each other. Now, whilst altruistic acts are quite prevalent in society, we have to understand why in some circumstances somebody will not provide help during an emergency situation. We call this the bystander intervention. Now, we enter this model here and we say, well, the presence of others taking no action, step one. This is what you could go through and think. Does the person notice the event? Maybe it's nothing. It's impolite to stare, no intervention. If it's a yes, step two, does the person interpret the situation as an emergency? It couldn't be an emergency, or somebody would be doing something by now. It could be a hoax. If it's a yes, step 3, does the person take personal responsibility here? Someone else will call the appropriate authority. I don't want to get involved. If it's a yes, then you'll intervene. If it's a no to any of them steps, the general pattern is that you won't intervene. Now, we call this the diffusion of responsibility. We see that as group size increases, responsibility becomes diffused amongst the group. So we lose this sense of personal responsibility to act because we see others as equally responsible to a situation. Bystanders and other people that feel anonymous, part of a large crowd, for example, are less likely to help and more likely to justify their inaction. And there have been many cases all around the world where situations have happened where there was a very famous one in America, which the bystander effect was studied on, where over 100 people heard a person screaming and then eventually a gun being fired, but no one actually called the police or attended the event. And when they interviewed people and interviewed all the people that did hear and were in the area at the time, they all said that they heard it. And when asked why they didn't do or act or call anyone, their response was, well, I thought somebody else must have heard it as well, so they would have called or they would have said something or they may have helped. Now, as well as the bystander effect and the influence that others can have in terms of group size, there are many social influences that um, the presence of others can have that can alter our own human behavior. We have this concept of social facilitation. So, this is the presence of others that can facilitate our performance. So, sometimes people can be around me that can help me get to a particular situation or a particular environment or a particular outcome by facilitating that experience or facilitating the outcome for me. We do see de-individualization that can occur in a crowd. So people can lose their individual identity in a crowd. And we do see that people tend to lose their ability to judge right from wrong when in a crowd as well. This sometimes can explain when groups can get into riots or protests can go really sour and violence can occur. Individually, that person wouldn't go out there and harm somebody or do something wrong or commit a crime, but in a group, they're more likely to do it because the responsibility tends to be diffused. And we also have, with social influence, self-fulfilling prophecies. And these center around false impressions of a situation, can evoke this behavior that makes these impressions become true. Okay, we can have these impressions of a particular scenario, a particular situation. We then enact a behavior that essentially seeks out and makes these impressions come to reality. Now, our final big topic for interpersonal social psychology is conformity. And conformity refers to a change in an attitude or behavior to accommodate the standards of peers or groups. The pressure to conform is often quite immense, and sometimes it can be very subtle to our awareness. For example, you all conform to fashions of the day to some extent. Now, a very famous study by Ash was carried out where participants were asked to judge line lengths while working in a group environment. They were presented this line here. They were then presented 3 options. They were asked to say, of lines 1, 2, or 3, which line is the exact same length as the one displayed here? Now, Ash was very smart and he employed a lot of actors, and he got the actors to raise their hands to the incorrect line lengths. So, for example, if I asked you, the room, what is the correct line length? And you all put your hand up and said, or sorry, everyone else in the room put their hand up and said 1, and you're thinking, wait a minute, no, it's number 2. Ash found that over time, people tended to conform with the crowd despite really knowing and thinking that this would be the line. So whilst they initially thought, well, yes, this is number two, because it's obvious that is the same length line. But if somebody else says the different answer, even if it's incorrect, people tended to go along with the incorrect answer because that's what the group did. Now we see with conformity that group size matters. Larger groups tend to elicit more conformity. We can see that dissension is important too. Even if one person dissents from the group, participants then followed their own judgment. So this is the person that's going against the group norm. This is the person that's saying, no, I don't agree with that. As soon as that person's there, other people in the room go, oh, I actually agree with him or her, so I'm going to now follow them as well. And we see that the group um, and the individuals in that group tend to step away from the group norm and follow their own decision-making process. Personality is very informant with conformity as well. We see those that with very low self-esteem are more likely to conform to group standards and group experiences. And culture is also very important. So people from collectivist cultures are more likely to conform to the group norm. And it's very important to know and to remember that conformity is not a bad behavior. It's not a bad thing. It doesn't take away you as an individual, and it doesn't discount you as an individual either. Conformity is absolutely necessary for social coherence and for society to function. For example, you all conform, if you do drive, to drive on the left-hand side of the road. If you didn't, there would be accidents, people would get hurt, and it would be very, very bad. You also conform to a general societal rule that you would queue up to get cash out at the ATM. You would queue up at the cafeteria. You would queue up at the coffee shop, that we form lines. We've probably all been in situations possibly where people haven't conformed to that rule and they're all crowding around a particular area. And we get very dissatisfied and we get very annoyed by this because it doesn't conform to society's norms. Okay, and that is it. So that concludes our social psychology and interpersonal psychology lecture. Please go and have a look at your textbook and go from the subject outline, and it will tell you the specific page numbers for you to read that are examinable on the online test. I understand and appreciate that this is an online lecture, and there's little sort of back and forth conversation that can be had, and there's little elaboration that I can extend and bounce off you guys, which you always so wonderfully allow me to do. But I do want to say a very big thank you to you all. You've been an absolute pleasure to teach. You're very engaged and you've motivated me all semester. So I look very much forward to seeing you all again in session two for more fun learning. All right, all the best. Thank you.